AVA Gallery, 11 Bank Street, Lebanon, New Hampshire. I'm here with Toby, and it's Toby Bartles. This is what I think of as the introductory wall, which I studied for quite a while when I first came to this show, so I thought we could start here.
Sounds good.
And before I even begin, I never really focused on the dates. What are the time periods for this whole show?
All of these paintings on this wall and this one and back there were started less than a year ago.
Oh, good.
Last February, mid to late February.
So they're really new.
So they're
this
fresh.
Year. Oh, great.
They are fresh, just as they look. They are very fresh. The first one was this one. These paintings were a transition partly from using the brush exclusively. I used to paint outdoors on site, and right here is the only brush mark that was used in any of these paintings. And this was subsequently the first move I made.
Oh.
And from there, the palette knife kind of took over and took control, and that's what you see before you.
I also noticed interesting titles, which almost leads one to believe you had been outside. Titles such as
Sure.
Outpost, Red Dune. I love the names, actually. Glacial Bay, Northern Latitude. So these names, as I stood here, it's like having a title on a poem. And then I look for, what was your experience with that particular location? Or those words, as well as the paintings. Do you want to talk about that?
All the paintings were made indoors. There's no reference from the outside world except maybe things that I've filtered through my experience in painting outdoors. So I would paint the paintings first, and then I would come up with titles. And that's how they came about. You know, this one, for instance, figure in pink, is for me a head and then a figure's body. And then
I immediately thought of flesh when you even said that with the brush.
Sure, okay, interesting.
Just look at the hand and the...
And this one, for instance, is pyrocumulus, which in the meteorological world has to do with fire cloud.
Oh.
And I was reading about clouds, trying to get a visual inspiration, and then before I knew it, the names became an inspiration. And for me, that I guess they're kind of resonated with the red and the orange and the yellow. That maybe that might not be a bad title. This one was hard to come up with. Outpost. I had really no idea until I asked a friend of mine what he thought of it. And as much as I did think of it as sort of something in the Arctic. These colors maybe think of the Arctic, but then these maybe think of like the Caribbean, and that's where I got tripped up. And he said, in the Arctic or the Antarctica, they'll have buildings that'll be a really bright color, like maybe a yellow or a bright red. And I thought, okay, well maybe that really does take after being farther north. So I thought, why not call it Outpost?
I think it's interesting that evolving along with the painting, our thoughts and imagery and in your imagination is inspired by the actual process.
Right.
I love that.
Right.
So it's not tight. You don't have some great intention about what it is, but it's paint.
Right.
And I haven't seen a lot of people painting in that way in a while, and I love these paintings. In fact, I would love you to talk just a bit about your inspiration. I think, of course, of Diebenkorn immediately. But his work did begin as actual landscapes.
Right.
And there were a lot of painters when I was a young artist, like David Parks and others, that were moving back and forth from imagery to these wonderful strokes of paint, or swashes, as you say, with your tool. But you're younger, so I keep thinking Hans Hofmann might have been more familiar.
My inspirations early on were Van Gogh and Cézanne.
Wow, that's where everybody starts, I think.
Very much Van Gogh. I think much more because of how emotional he was with his
Yes,
with
but
his
even
paint.
these palettes. I mean, I've been recently looking because
You
there's
think
a show of
similar
his
to that?
portraits on in London.
Oh, yeah.
So I went back to an old catalog and a show of portraits in Boston. And some of these palettes and textures are very much like his.
Well, it's
as
interesting
well.
to hear. Yeah, I haven't heard that yet.
Yeah.
My inspirations, I guess, much more recently have been de Kooning
Oh,
over
good.
anybody else. Partly because I'm reading
Oh,
about him. I just
right.
finished his American Masters book by
I haven't heard that.
Yeah, it's great. Annalyn Swan and Mark Stevens. And it was more about me reading about his life and understanding sort of what he did on a day-to-day basis and the way his life progressed.
Well, and even this flesh-like remainder here, I mean, because he went back and forth starting with figurative
right, yeah,
abstractions
it seemed like
from
it was
the
always
female
with
form.
the figure, yeah, I find that even with these landscapes, even some of the
Yes.
passages have this sort of figural and
Yeah.
aspect. And where I went to school, that's all that we did was we painted 8 hours a day and drew 8 hours a day from the figure.
Tell me a little bit more
figure,
about
so.
the school. I read a bit about
It's
this.
the New York Studio School on 8th Street in New York in Greenwich Village, and it was a 3-year program, and I attended for the full 3 years, and very hands-on,
Great.
gritty. We'd be dirty all the time.
Not a lot of
Charcoal.
theory, but a lot of working at drawing and painting.
Yes, drawing, painting, and sculpture, and sculpture.
And
so
sculpture.
There's a definite sculptural feel, obviously, with the use of the palette
Yes.
knife. So that comes through as well.
Well, being an admirer of Eric Aho, another wonderful artist from our region who's been showing here and all over the country, I think. And,
the world, too.
and senior to you, too, I think, right?
Yes.
I mean, quite a bit. So I know that you do know him and admire him, too. What kinds of things do you think you might have learned from watching Eric and being his friend?
Honestly, I liked his work, but I wasn't
Aware
completely enthralled by his work.
Oh.
I greatly admired what he did and how he did, but I was much more into that sort of Cezanne control of smaller brushstrokes and just sort of, carefully kind of building up an image. And it wasn't until I met him at his Spheres show last year, I can't remember the month it was, but shortly thereafter, I went to New York with him to deliver some paintings, and upon my arrival from New York back here, I started painting these.
Oh, interesting.
And de Kooning I respected, but I was never really into his work so much. I just, I loved it, but it wasn't really for me.
So you
And
come from a different place, but there's a
Yeah.
little resonance now.
Definitely a
Yeah,
resonance.
that's
Now that I'm
nice.
using the palette knife and sort of spreading my grasp a little more, it's becoming much more clear that I'm definitely being influenced and taking on this sort of feeling that Eric might imbue in his work. So.
Oh, it's fun to see
Yeah,
the
it
culture
is. And you never know.
interacting
It
around here. We
changes and
want
you
that.
change with it or you don't,
We do
right?
want that. Peek at some of these titles.
Yep, there's Plains, which was the more obvious title, I think, for all of these. Sea Bank here, which I'm not really sure why. Sea Bank might come off as from like a, an underwater grass kind of fog almost kind of feel. Storm King, this, I don't have any idea why I picked Storm King other than that, because for me it's so sculptural.
Oh,
It
I see.
relates
Yeah.
to the sculpture park down in New York State, I
Mhm.
believe, or Connecticut, I can't remember where it is.
New York State.
New York State, yeah. And I had been there once, and this was more sort of my homage to that place.
And to sculpture.
And the sculpture. This one, Basin, mainly because it seemed like it was a sort of a city-type scape in maybe a southwest kind of valley. And then Tar Kettle Shore, this is a much more a painting that refers directly to a place up in North Haven, Maine, where I have family, and I believe I'm 5th generation of people living in North Haven, mainly in the summers traveling there. And there's a shore called Tar Kettle Beach, and I think that's a place where they would bring in barges maybe, or it was a place where they would bring ships in for like bringing in large construction and things like that. And so that's my memory of that place in particular.
You know, when I first looked at this wall, it looked as if you had an encaustic surface. It has an almost waxy, like the encaustic painting, and I love that. It's a different. There doesn't seem to be much medium with the paint, at least not much varnish.
Not really.
How do you paint? Just
The
with
only
oil?
medium that I use is that I started to use more in when I got bigger pieces. I would want to extend the life of the paint. I would use cold wax medium. But so
That would be
that's-
on larger
that's-
pieces.
That's pretty much,
Yeah.
it's all pretty much oil. Nothing
Well, for
else.
people who love to look at painting that's about painting, this is one of the best shows we've had on that approach. And I think we can talk a lot about them, but most importantly, we should continue to look and come here and look at these. And we'll move on now to another wall, which will show you a bit about his experience of painting, I think. So we'll go there.
Good.
Well,
Here's
I
the
said
wall.
earlier why I love this. You can feel the gesture literally of the person who stood in front of one of those wonderful small squares that have become the beautiful paintings that are in this show. And yet this has now become a very popular piece over here, and people are saying, have you seen it? And I'm wondering where it might lead you. I hope it doesn't lead you away from the center work, but on the other hand, it's a beautiful thing to see the presence of an artist when you're absent. And that's
Right.
how I see it.
That's exactly what it is.
And the gestures, reaching out.
Yeah.
Show us how
Yeah,
you
the
did it.
gestures, this is more or less the height that I work at on each painting. And you can see the screws
Yeah.
in here. You can see all the screw holes. And what I would do, for instance, I'd put a painting up, and the screw holes down here would fasten in and pin the sides down. If you look on a lot of the paintings, you'll see
Oh, yeah.
a half round so that even then in the paintings, you'll see this immense sense of function going on as to
Yeah.
how they were painted. And this is all right-handed. So as you can see, for instance, some of these marks, they start out thin and they get more broad because that's the way the palette knife is made. So this is all this motion, even like this. And this wall has a lot to do with cleaning my palette knife to the best that I could. And I would use a rag if I really wanted to make a clean color. I'd wipe it off much more so. But that's all this wall is.
And it
All
makes
this wall
anyone
is.
who paints, and even people who don't paint anymore, want to keep painting. Because the
Good, I
minute
hope
you
so.
see it up
Great.
close, you just want to
Yeah.
move some paint around and really get
Yeah.
into it and enjoy
Yeah.
what happens with color. It almost feels like a section of a Monet, or it's very
Sure.
beautiful just by itself, and it takes up this whole wonderful diagonal corner here, which also for the exhibition acts as a great little guide to the
Perfect,
show,
isn't it? Yeah.
and keeps us from entering into the other exhibition
And yet
yet.
there's enough room to do so.
Yeah, it's wonderful. So I see why it's so popular.
I know. I don't know if it needs to be any more popular than it is.
Well, and maybe
I'm not
it
sure the
won't have
direction.
much to do with things. But just talking about the idea that a right hand, a stroke,
Right.
a particular size of a tool, those things keep you thinking forward. So
Right.
I bet you'll learn from it as well as these.
Probably. I will say one thing about this wall is that I have no problems painting it over.
That's good too, though.
No problem.
It's experience.
Yeah.
Let's look at these. These are a different scale and somewhat different. Were they early or later?
The one on the right, South by Southwest, which is
Yeah.
actually a play on Hitchcock's North by Northwest.
Uh-huh.
I had a hard time coming up with the title, but I did feel it was like a Nevada,
Yeah.
kind of landscape.
Oh,
and
yes.
I decided to just roll with that. That was one of the first. That was the first 18 by 18 that I did.
I see. Mm-hmm.
And as I started out in the beginning, I was treating these paintings much more in terms of how a landscape might read, with a top background and then a middle midground and a frontal foreground.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where that's coming from. But this was actually the last painting I painted for the show, which is the last 18 by 18.
So this is
that I did.
early and that was the
That's
last.
right.
That's kind of nice on this
Yeah.
wall. The other question I had in mind when I came in earlier was to talk about the palette a little bit. I mean, I realize now that I understand that these come from deep inside an imagination and emotions and feelings. But just, do you want to talk a bit about your palette? Because there's such a wonderful variety of
I don't
the way
know.
you're using your color.
Yeah, there isn't really so much. It largely has to do with instinct. If I decide that I want to use like purple up top for maybe a sky feel, or I don't even know if I'm making a sky at that point. It's
It's just the
you know,
purple.
a lot of the times these paintings have to do with just the gesture and the process of trying to continually find that image. Like for instance, on here, there's even still some of a previous painting here.
Yeah, I like that.
Which
red.
you can see happening. Even the red here is in the back, and even the orange. But the orange, the sky wouldn't have worked without this orange coming through the purple. So, and a lot has to do with recognition. If I make a mark or a movement, I have to step back. If it sort of hits me that this area is actually working well, and I don't know why, I have to sit back and sort of look at it, and then leave it alone and try and move on. But at the same time, not being precious and keeping it, but letting it go if the painting has to mature into a better place. So the palette in terms of color, I don't know, a lot of it happens fairly quickly. If I'm working in an area and I think certain colors are good, I'll think what other color might work well with that and where should I put it.
Well, it makes for a very interesting exhibition. And I think that the constancy of a certain kind of gesture and various widths of strokes, etc., do give it a theme. So you don't come in feeling, what's this, how does this hang together? It hangs together really, really well. And I didn't mean to say that it didn't. But what I really love is, for me, to see the bravery of these palettes. I think sometimes we become timid in work and find a sort of comfort zone in a palette.
Well, it's
that's
hard to be
not
timid
here.
using a palette knife, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And I notice that I do, and I try and make it pretty, if you will, or finish it.
But the paint takes over.
And it just doesn't work, and I have to destroy it once again to come back to it.
Well, it looks like the paint's in charge, and that would be good.
Yeah. I'm glad that I'm not fully in charge, because that doesn't really work.
This is a wonderful little one here, too.
I like that too.
Yeah.
That's one of my favorites.
It's especially
One of the
nice
later ones
today
that I
on
did.
this bright day. I like the light.
Colors pop a
Yeah.
bit more, I think. Why squares? Well, I hadn't really utilized square much in the past in working outdoors on-site painting. It was much more about the landscape feel on the rectangle and the horizontal. And I think mainly because I didn't quite know what I was doing in these paintings when I first did it. I thought if I was going to go more abstract, then the simplest shape, being the square, would lend itself just fine.
And it adds another constant. And I think that always happens in body work, that helps with the decisions within a format.
And so for me, beyond that constant square, what comes up, because now the square is taken care of and I don't have to think about it. It's just a square. I work in a square. Is the depth of the canvas that it comes off the wall, and that to me is really important. And some I think are just fine, and some could be a little bigger. As I get bigger, I find the depth has to be a little more, which means I have to make these myself.
That's the sculpture.
I can't pre-order.
That's the
a bunch
sculptor
of
in you too.
Right.
Thinking in terms
The
of an
relief
object, not
kind of.
just the surface.
The crow's nest. I think I came up with this title the day before the opening. I had a really hard time coming up with this, but I really liked it, and some other people, some older peers of mine, really thought that this was a finished painting, and I wasn't sure if it was. Mainly because sometimes some of these paintings just come about where there's a lot of underpainting here. This is all under. It's a painting from the past. And I start to rework it and open it back up, and if I'm in sort of the right frame of mind where I can flow and make things much more rhythmical, then and then I stop, it actually starts to feel like there's some freshness that's been brought back into the piece. And this one I left alone because I liked it, but I wasn't sure if I liked it enough to keep it the way it was. And before I knew it, I hadn't painted on it for a while, and it dried. And once it dries, if you go back into it, it's like starting all over again. You might as well. But I always found that there was an inherent sort of me-ness in this painting, and I wasn't sure what it was or why it was, and so I left it. But it was so confusing to me that the title came about from, and this relates back to de Kooning. They used to frequent down at the Cedar Bar in New York City off of 10th Street, I think, and this is a bar that is no longer in existence. That was down from the school that I went to on 6th Street. So I thought, well, why not just give it that title. And actually, when New York City stopped, when they banned smoking in restaurants, shortly thereafter the bar closed, I think. One of those things. Just didn't jive.
Didn't
So,
work for those.
yeah.
Well, I really like talking to you.
Yeah?
And I think what I'd like to
Likewise.
do is really encourage people. I hope this gets on in time to see the show. When is the show over?
The 6th of February.
6th of February, AVA Gallery, and they're open every day but Monday. And there's some events going on, so if you go on their website, just go to AVA Gallery and Google it, I don't know specifics. I'm sure you'll find other things going on here that will bring you in. Don't miss this wonderful show.
Great.
And more to come, I
Great.
hope.
Yeah, definitely.
Good.
Definitely more to come.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you.